Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Sunday Talk within the Nine-Sided Circle. I'm one of your hosts. I'm Noor Kyle.
And I'm the other one of your hosts, Mushtaq Ali.
Yes. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. We are going with the second part of our kind of impromptu 3-part series. And we're excited to talk about it, as I'm sure most people who are going to be checking in on this video are, because we are going to be talking about sex as a stumbling block, both in the path and in life in general. But before we get into that, we got to do the whole YouTube spiel. You want to take the lead on that, Mushtaq?
All right, I will take the lead on the YouTube spiel. If you are listening to us on YouTube and this is your first time, welcome. If this is not your first time, welcome anyway. If you have not done so yet, write down somewhere here, you will find a button that says subscribe. And if you hit that button and if you hit the bell that's next to that button, you will be subscribed to our channel, which is a wonderful thing, because that means that you will know when we put things out, which is at least once a week. And we're running a special. Right now, we are 8 people away from hitting 300 subscribers, which for the big channels is no big deal. I mean, 300 subscribers, but for us, that's a big deal because we don't advertise and stuff. So from now until we hit 300 subscribers, if you're a new subscriber to this and you go down there to the comments and you comment that you're a new subscriber, you can ask us a question in the comments and we will do our best to answer it. Or you can ask us for a topic for our talks and we will do our best to come up with to use that as a topic. If we don't know anything about the topic, we'll make something plausible up for you.
That's how we roll. Yeah.
That's how we roll. Yes.
Yes. And as always, we appreciate feedback, whether it's positive, negative, neutral.
Yeah. Yeah. If you liked us, hit the thumbs up button.
Thumbs up.
If you hate us, hit the hate button.
Thumbs down.
Yeah.
We'll take it.
And give us comments. Good. We love the comments. Comments forever.
So there you go. Thanks, everybody. So, Mushtaq, today we're talking about sex.
Gasp.
Ooh, gasp. So
Gasp.
Scandalous. All right. So where should we start?
Let's start with, so I took my first degree in anthropology. And for the longest time, the thought in anthropology is that there was no universal when it came to sexual mores or ways cultures handled the idea of sex. But this turned out not to be true. There is no culture on this planet where sex is unregulated in some form or another. At least none that we've found.
All right. So when you say sex is regulated, say more about that. What do you mean?
That means like if you're an ancient Egyptian in the royal family, you must marry your siblings. If you're an American, you can't marry your siblings.
Nor your cousins these days.
Yeah, I think second cousins is still okay, but a little bit frowned upon.
And it's interesting because 200 years ago, that was pretty normal. Yeah. Even 150 years ago or less. Yep. So that's a newer taboo, interestingly enough.
So one of the things that we note is that in all cultures, sexuality is regulated. It's regulated differently. We find no universal, you must do this, you must do that, but it's always regulated. Why do you think this is? Not a rhetorical question. Feel free to chime in.
I'm going to open that up to everybody else. What do you guys think?
The impulse to meddle in other people's sex lives is even stronger than the sex drive.
You may be onto something there, Nancy.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely this societal need, drive, push to meddle in the sex lives of private citizens. That's for sure. What do you guys think about that, though? Yeah, Jonathan.
Well, unwanted babies is a serious problem, especially for the babies themselves.
Yeah.
That is definitely an issue that comes into play. Yes. Chris, what do you think?
Sex is a very powerful process. And so, I think that would lend towards some kind of people wanting to regulate in different ways.
Definitely true. Yes. Yep, it is one of the most powerful processes.
Yeah. Perhaps even the most powerful process, number one. But we can't say that out loud because they'll burn us at the stake. So here's a thought. Y'all have y'all heard about Nexium, the cult that was just like reamed all over the news in the last couple of years?
And also called ESP. What was that? Executive. God, what was it?
Yeah.
In any case.
Executive success programs.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
Yes. So this is part of Nexium at large.
Yeah. So here you have this group of people, and for probably some years, ex-members were trying to convince the government that this was a criminal organization, and they were getting nowhere. And it was not until they could come up with a sex scandal that the DA and the government and such like the FBI bothered to take notice. And when it comes down to it, and you can check this out, there's a couple of moderately good documentaries on it. The Vow on Netflix, and what was that?
HBO maybe, or Stars? I think it was HBO and Stars.
Yeah, HBO was The Vow, and Stars was the other one about Catherine Oxenberg's daughter.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And the thing was that when push came to shove, objectively speaking, the sexual parts of Nexium were not that weird or unusual. I mean, I've seen kinkier shit just in San Francisco. It's like, yeah, they were all into the whole BDSM stuff.
Well, specifically within this small sub-community within Nexium. Yeah.
There was a lot of bad shit going on, I have to say. And the Keith Raniere, the leader, was about as misogynist a person as I have seen in many years. But the criminality was way more around money and abuse of power and that sort of things than it was around sexuality. But the sexuality was what everybody focused on. So every society says, thou shalt not break the sexual norms. And of all of the ways that you can break norms within a society, that is the one that freaks people out the most.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So when you have an organization like, say, Nexium, and they're doing some shady shit legally, politically, all that stuff, it's not until they start breaking those sexual norms that people really start to get their hair triggers set off. And then scandal, because as if bad things weren't already happening.
Yeah, and I am not saying that Raniere et al. Did not deserve to have everything that happened to them happen to them, but it may have happened to them for the wrong reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here we go. So, anyway, the breaking of sexual norms. Yeah. What was that? Go for it, Nancy.
Well, it may depend on the society. Some of them are very twitchy about breaking religious norms also,
Yeah.
but it might be the same kind of disproportion.
Yep. And a lot of the religious norms are, in fact, sexual norms.
Yeah, but non-sexual norms can be a big issue too.
It would be interesting to see, to give religious people a poll and to see where the biggest charge is. Like, yeah, here in the States, gay marriage, huge charge amongst the religious crowd. You know, probably abortion has a bigger charge, but not by much.
Yeah, but there were times and places where they would kill over heresy, which
Yeah.
was not necessarily about sex.
If you read various heresy charges, there is almost always some sex thrown in. He was having sex with the devil.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I would suggest. Yeah.
Yeah. Everything goes better with sex when you're trying to oppress a group. You know, look at the Templars. You know, they were accused of salacious homosexual acts. And it probably wasn't even true. But that was one of the big charges of their heresy. Yes, spitting on the cross and, you know, all of that. But it was the getting down with each other part that really got everybody's attention. Just a thought. It's something with a really heavy charge in just about every culture. We don't like it. So, why do you think this is? Why does that have such a heavy charge? Don't everybody talk at once.
Go for it, Chris.
Because it is a powerful thing, a powerful process. It can be used in ways that create significant effects, like creating humans, or like messing with relationships, or causing trauma. Or I mean, there's just so much around how it could be engaged with that can cause harm, that I think that has a lot of charge. And on the opposite end, it's a blissful, beautiful thing. So,
Yeah. And I think we have to look at the opposite end, because it's fairly apparent to me, though I have to admit to a certain amount of cynicism, that the powers that be don't care much about the harm.
yeah.
They care about this other thing. So let's look at human sexuality. What is unique or nearly unique about human sexuality?
Well, us and the dolphins do it for fun.
Yes, we are one of very, very few species that have the ability to have sex anytime we want. There's us, there's dolphins, there's bonobos. Bonobos are the hippies of the chimp world. And that's about it. Maybe some of the other cetaceans. But for most animals, you have a cycle. The female goes into heat. She gives off pheromones and becomes the most attractive girl in the tribe. And then all the boys chase her around until she comes out of heat again. And then she's like, just another one of the people. Where humans differ is that the female of our species doesn't need to go into heat. to be receptive to sex. And that creates some interesting stuff. And the female of our species is intentionally designed to have a lot of fun having sex. Did you know that? This is something that my folks knew a long time ago, but a lot of the Western world seems to have forgotten that women are hardwired to really enjoy sex. They are in possession of the only organ that is designed specifically and for no other purpose that we can determine than to produce pleasure. Interesting thing. And it works all the time. Women don't need to hit any cycle in order to be sexual. The on switch has been flipped and glued open. And it's the same thing. Well, guys are much simpler. You hit 13 or so, the switch in your head is thrown open, and you spend the next several years wanting to mate with anything that moves, more or less.
The other thing is that people have human women have concealed fertility,
Yes.
which is also kind of weird.
Yep.
Yeah, that is another one of those things. Yep.
Yep. If you are a chimp or a gorilla or a dog or a cat, there is no doubt when you are fertile. With women, who knows?
Well, I mean, there are signs, but it's not as visually explicit as with other animals. That's for sure.
Yeah, it doesn't. With other animals, it doesn't even have to be visually explicit. It's
pheromones and
pheromones. Yes.
all that stuff. Yeah. Yep.
So, why would humans have developed this? What is the evolutionary advantage to this?
Jonathan, you got any thoughts?
Only that I don't see any evolutionary advantage to this. And please enlighten me.
Yeah. Let me suggest to you that this form of sexuality has the potential, rarely actualized these days, but has the potential to help human beings move from their adolescent larval state into an adult state. First of all, first and foremost, because human sexuality is designed to allow you to experience the other as subject. Now, adolescents do not experience the other as subject by and large. And I speak from having been an adolescent and experiencing the shock and horror of having friends who I had known for sometimes my whole life all of a sudden become objects of desire. Think about that phrase, object of desire. Not subject of desire, object of desire. You stop looking at that girl who you grew up with as a subjectivity and see her as an object to be possessed. And it is an incredibly powerful, crazy making phenomena to experience the chemical cascade that produces that reaction in you. I can only speak from the guy point of view, and perhaps nor can speak from the female point of view at the same time. But
Uh,
Mustakim says something very important here. You want to read that, Nor?
Yes. Yeah. Mustakim says the power in society trying to control it, to control the people underneath them.
Yeah,
So.
that is definitely part of it. And Chris mentions lots of nerve endings. As it happens, the sexual organs do not have a lot of nerve endings. You have way more nerve endings in your hands and your lips than you do in your genitalia. You have more nerve endings in your feet than you have in your genitalia. The ones in your genitalia are easily stimulated, but there's not lots of them. That's a weird part of this.
That's interesting. I mean, I thought the clit had like a ton of nerve endings.
Not particularly. Yeah, it's a weird thing. Look up homunculus and get a picture of male and female homunculus from the interwebs, and those are images of a body proportioned by its nerve endings. And what you'll see is huge lips, gigantic hands, big feet, head's okay, big tongue. Genitalia, not so much.
Is it the nerve endings or is it the handling in the brain? Yeah,
Both.
there's a
Both.
homunculus in the brain.
Yeah, it's both.
Okay.
So yeah, as far as my experience as a teenager went, I mean, I think it's a bit more diffuse, but there definitely is this sense of being, you know, compelled towards sexual behavior and thoughts and stuff like that. So I can speak to that. As far as objects, yeah, to some degree, there is this objectification. I mean, I am attracted to people across the gender spectrum. So for me personally, I do notice that I tend to objectify women more, and there may be various reasons for that, but it's a thing, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, my experience with the other as an adolescent male was that I experienced girls as wanting emotional contact more than physical contact.
Mm.
And that seemed to be profoundly important. Fortunately or unfortunately, I was too stupid to really understand all of the implications of that when I was like 14. But so here you have this thing. And I am suggesting that sexuality is one of the things that can produce human adulthood because it can become a direct experience of the other as subject. It's not the only way to do it, but it is a very powerful way if you can overcome the desire to see the other as object. In our culture, you get rewarded for experiencing the other as object. You know what you call a guy who experiences the other as object and acts upon it? Anybody take a guess? They are known as players or pickup artists.
Yes.
Yes.
I was going to say predator, but you know.
Yeah, well, that's both.
Are you saying that experiencing someone as a subject rather than an object has evolutionary advantage? It probably has their
Yes.
genes there.
I am saying that there's definitely an evolutionary advantage to it, and in personal evolution especially.
Well, but I mean,
We have forgotten that the best leaders are the ones with the most empathy.
But does it help to propagate your genes? I guess, I mean, fundamentally, that's what evolution is about, isn't it? I mean, you know,
Well, that's what biological evolution is about, but there is more than one kind of evolution.
okay, so you're not talking about necessarily biological evolution here.
Actually, if you want to talk biological evolution, we should have never gotten away from having seasons. Because that is incredibly efficient.
You mean like mating seasons?
Yeah, like mating seasons. When a female of, say a chimp pack, whatever you call a group of chimpanzees, goes into heat, she is the most popular girl in the pack. There is no being on the outs. There is no not being attractive. She is 100% the most popular girl there. And every boy wants to mate with her. And they will fight for the privilege of mating for her. That fighting produces, strong genes, because the winner is usually the strongest, most aggressive chimp. And there it goes until the next girl goes into heat, and then she's the most popular. You don't have to worry about being the girl that the guys aren't attracted to, because the mere fact of you releasing the sexual pheromones into the air makes you the one who's most attractive. It is considerably more difficult for us to consummate any form of relationship.
Okay, so I just want to be clear where you were heading. So it's not biological evolution you're talking about, but a different kind of evolution, presumably.
Yeah, I'm talking, evolution is change over time. That's all evolution is. So biological change over time, psychological change over time, spiritual change over time, they can all be considered evolutionary if they follow certain rules.
It's really depending on what direction that change is going, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, whether or not the direction is viable determines that. Survival of the fittest always comes into play. Fittest doesn't mean strongest. Fittest means most adaptable to the situation. If fittest meant strongest, then we would all be Neanderthals, because they were way stronger than Homo sapien.
Okay, so I mean, I follow you, and I see where you're heading, and I guess I'm interested in seeing where that road leads. I thought you were talking originally about biological evolution.
Biology, because we're talking sex, has to come into it at certain points. But human sexuality is kind of wacky compared to the rest of the animal world.
Yeah. Jonathan, did you have some thoughts you wanted to share?
Yeah, I did. Isn't the state of being in love more of an asleep state? Because there's all the jealousy and possessiveness and exclusiveness that is involved in it.
Well, we're going to have to define our terms here. The state of being in love, as you're describing it, is a physiological state that is triggered by the release of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. The interesting thing is that it can't really last longer than maximum 18 months, 2 years, or your brain stops making them. And the neurotransmitters are ones that are very similar to cocaine, strangely enough. You see this all the time. People fall in love, and then they're like head over heels with somebody, and then they're not, and they're on to the next one. People become addicted to that rush. I
I call
remember
it, yeah, I call it being on drugs because that's exactly what it is.
yeah,
Essentially.
and it's when you see this, it's shocking. I remember when I figured this out. I was probably 19, maybe 20, and I was head over heels in love with this girl for about 6 months. And one morning I woke up and looked at her and went, who the fuck is this? And what is she doing here? There is nothing about her that I actually even like. I mean, it was like somebody threw a switch in my head. Nothing about her had changed. The only thing that had changed is whatever endogenous cocaine like substances were being released into my brain either stopped or I developed a tolerance to them. And that was it. That was the end of that relationship. And if I had followed the pattern that so many people follow, I would have gone out and looked for somebody else who could stimulate that same response in me. And I would have had serial relationships like that often for the rest of your life. Fortunately, I learned better. So that's being in love, falling in love. But there's also loving another person, which is utterly different. Totally, completely does not relate to that because it is not chemical in nature. I mean, except insofar as everything that goes on in your brain is chemical in nature in some way or another. But loving somebody does not induce jealousy, does not induce any of these negative states that you were mentioning. But only adult humans are capable of it. Just a thought. Only adult humans are really capable of loving another human being.
So in this context, when defining terms again, what are you meaning by love?
I mean, feeling a sense of connection with another person, feeling a desire to increase in closeness, uh, having motivation to work on your relationship with that person to deepen it every single day, delighting in that person's company, whether they are feeding your ego or not. Things like that. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do. And this ties back to when we were talking about treating someone like an object versus sharing in their subjectivity with yours, you know?
Yes.
Of course, the internet and especially Facebook is full of interesting videos of, cats doing that with horses and different species that obviously have no sexual relationships between each other, yet seem to have very close bonding. That sounds very much like the sort of things that you were just describing.
Yeah, except that it's not.
In what ways is it not?
Because you use the word bonding. Bonding is again a physiological sort of thing that happens often when an animal is in a point of imprint vulnerability. Conrad Lorenz wrote whole books on this. Like the duckling who imprints on a ping pong ball just as it hatches from its egg and then follows ping pong balls around as if it were their mother and wants to mate with ping pong balls when it's an adult. That is an example of bonding at an imprint level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but there's plenty of videos at least out there.
Videos mean what? You are creating what the video means, man. The cat probably has its own opinions, but you're the one who's ascribing meaning to the video, not the cat.
Same with, well, when we observe people's behavior, presumably. But anyway, it's from your description of love, at least the outward appearances of it, I see that same thing between various species of animals.
But I don't care what the outward experience looks like. What I care is what the inward experience actually is.
So that's presumably what we need to get at in answer to Noor's question. How do you define love in that sense? What is that Inuit experience which makes it love?
It's a little bit like pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
Okay.
Well, I think a big piece comes down to, I mean, we can't really, I think I follow what Mushtaq is saying. Like, we cannot really put words to a cat's experience, right? That's not our place. And meanwhile, for human beings, of course, we can't read other people's minds, but we can talk about experiences together and develop some kind of common language about what we're experiencing. So in this context, we're talking about the experience we have when we are in connection with another person in a way that acknowledges their inwardness, their own experience as separate from us, but it's kind of like a shared blessing, I guess, in the sense that we benefit from supporting their subjectivity. It's mutually nourishing.
And between the two people that are experiencing this, it is clear.
Mm-hmm.
You, as a person who is looking at it from the outside, may not see anything. But that's neither here nor there. Yes, Jonathan.
Well, couldn't I experience that level of loving relation with my father or my brother?
Of course.
Yes,
there's no.
absolutely.
Okay. Is there so are you saying that nature gives humans an added ease of developing a path of learning how to love someone if it's with a partner in a sexual relationship?
Say rather an added possibility, because there's nothing about it that's easy.
Okay.
You have to overcome all of that stuff about the other as object. It's actually quite hard. But, and this gets to the next part of this, the thing about sexuality is that it produces a possibility of re-imprinting. Whereas, say, love for your father, it's not going to do that. There is a thing about the combination of the openness and lovingness and the sexual energy that will allow you to produce a point of imprint vulnerability in yourself and your partner that very few other things can produce.
Yep. And this harkens back to what Chris was saying about this being one of the most powerful processes. There are potentially the most powerful.
Yes. And it can be used either to enslave people or to free them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And somehow society, quote unquote, knows this. Hence these weird taboos and such. Because those act as kind of a lever of control upon the people who make up that society.
And just for I mean, some of us are slow like me, so just to finish your train of thought, sex creates imprint vulnerability.
Sex can create imprint vulnerability under correct circumstances with the right people.
And some of what gets imprinted presumably is something that's undesirable, and the sort of thing you're talking about being imprinted is something that's desirable, right? Is that basically?
Usually what gets imprinted is pretty damn random. So people have a point of imprint vulnerability at puberty. And this will imprint both your sexual mores and where you fit in society, which is why it's called the sociosexual imprint. So, for instance, for me, I am utterly attracted to hippie girls. Hippie girls are the holy grail to my sexuality. Why is that? Well, let me see. 1967, Haight-Ashbury, coming of age, right? Took a heavy duty imprint. Now, my father always thought that women in high heels with seams up their nylons or up their silk stockings was the sexiest thing in the world. But, you know, he came into his puberty and sexual growth in the 30s. Now, my grandfather thought that flappers were the hottest thing since sliced bread. And if you had ever seen my grandmother in her 20s, you would understand why. She was a flapper and she was drop dead gorgeous. She almost looked like a hippie girl. So we take imprints at the point of our own sexual awakening.
And so to kind of extrapolate on the theme, are you suggesting that a reason that society is controlling sexuality is because it can create this imprint vulnerability? And are you suggesting that that control mechanism itself is trying to imprint a certain...
In some societies. Society is not an overall thing. Some societies go so far as to go through ceremonial imprints at the point of sexual vulnerability to make sure that you take the right imprint. Some societies will do that for the other natural imprint points. Our modern Western white people society doesn't do that to control how a person takes their imprint. So we take random imprints. What we do is control the society mostly through guilt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Guilt and shame and blame are the methods of control around modern Western sexuality.
And to what end? I mean, it's clear to what end, say, a society that has puberty rights and so forth, what they're trying to do with that, right? But what's the point of the control, say, in American society?
To keep the weirdos to a minimum, because weirdos are dangerous. Society is inherently conservative. It pretty much has to be.
Mm-hmm.
Society does not want change. So society will tend to select for what it considers societal norms. And I'm not even talking about a conscious process. Most of this goes without thinking. So what do you do with this?
Yeah, we have a question from Mustaqim. How do we connect the sexual thing to the process of awakening?
Ah, a very good question. First, every time you have a sexual desire, check with yourself to see if it's coming from a place of covetousness or a desire to actually meet the other person's inwardness. Don't even do anything about it. Just notice.
So when you say sexual covetousness, what do you mean?
When I was 16, I used to buy Playboy magazines, and I would look at the beautiful women in it, and I would covet them. I knew nothing about them. I could create fantasies in my mind about them, but I knew nothing about them. All I knew is that I desired them. As I got older, that was no longer a thing. Do you know what I personally find most attractive about a woman?
You want to tell everybody?
Her face.
Mm.
And that's because that's where I see the most of who she is. It's the same with guys, but there's because I'm pretty much channeled towards the heterosexual, I don't have as deep a response as I do to looking at a woman's face.
A man's face. Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I find a woman's voice more attractive than I find her face, interestingly enough. And I find her thoughts more attractive than her voice.
So that's where inwardness comes in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And meanwhile, we're living in the day of Pornhub and RedTube and OnlyFans.
And all of that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And OnlyFans is a little different because they do tend to be a bit more personal and intimate. However, with like
in how they create their
RedTube
fantasies, from what I
yeah,
understand.
it is a fantasy. So again, you're still not getting at that inwardness, and yet they're feeding on that desire for sharing in the inwardness, which is extra tricky because it's like a facade of that, a pretend version of that.
Now, when you're saying that it's the woman's voice and thoughts that you find especially interesting,
especially attractive.
especially attractive, yes.
Yes.
Is it any old thoughts, or is it those thoughts which
No, it's those thoughts which speak to me.
thoughts about swordsmanship?
Well, as a matter of fact, my last real crush was a fencer, a Spanish fencer, who I'm pretty sure I'm madly in love with, and I have never seen her outside of her fencing mask and jacket. But she moves so exquisitely beautifully. She is like this dangerous spirit when she is fencing on the, out on the square. That I found her just like, I could have a crush on her. I could have a teenage crush on her very, very easily. And I could not tell you anything about how she looks because I've never seen her with her fencing mask off.
But the way she moves, presumably you feel somehow reveals some aspect of her inward.
She moves like poetry.
I mean, I have a similar thing about some tango dancers. So
so you understand what I'm talking about.
But it's because in some sense, it's not just the movement, it's because it somehow reveals.
Yeah, she is showing, when she fences, she shows just a little tiny bit of her soul.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And like I said, I have no idea what she looks like to this very day, and I've never had a particular interest You know, when I think of her, I think of this beautiful thrust that she does, just going over the top of her opponent's sword and just nailing him.
Isn't that a little bit weird, though? I mean,
Of course, it's weird. I have no compunctions about admitting that I am a totally weird person.
yeah. But the particular weirdness that I was looking at here is, it seems like there would be a desire to get to know the rest of the person somehow.
If I ever met her in real life, I would definitely want to know everything about her. But it's not something that I ever expect to happen.
Okay.
And it's not a sexual thing. It's like, wow, what an incredible being this is.
Mhm. Yeah. And of course, sometimes you can see that in the way people talk. You know.
Yes, or you hear it in the way people talk,
Hmm.
or you
Yeah.
hear it in the way they sing.
Or see it in their artwork.
Yeah, or any of these things.
Yeah.
But I wonder, do you really want to get to know her completely, or is there a point of mystery where you want to hold off? I mean, like,
No, I don't sense a point of mystery. If I ever had a chance to sit down and get to know her, I would take that opportunity, and I would know as much of her as she would let be known, and I would be delighted with it.
so if we go on to the kind of, I mean, the classical tantra, for example, I assume that there we are using, among other things, sexual relationships in order not so much just to know the other person as a person, but rather to transcend just the persona itself, isn't it?
What Tantra does, if you're talking about real Tantra, not the bullshit that passes for Tantra here in the States, but real Tantra does not examine sexuality that much. And when it does it for the sense of breaking one's conditioning. If you look at one of the classic tantric texts, like the Vijnana Vairava, which gives you 125 or something different practices to do to awaken yourself. Out of that number, one of them has to do with sex.
And is, okay, I mean, I have not been a practitioner of classic Tantra, so I'm speaking from ignorance here, but is the path through seeing the other person as subjectivity, and then that subjectivity expands in a sense? Or is
the path through is seeing the divine in that other person and worshiping it.
right, which presumably is, I mean, but do you first see that, I mean, presumably, but if you treated that other person simply as an object, that would be a blockage right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, but if you understand the divine, you don't treat the divine as an object.
well, but that's what the whole point of Tantra and other such is to get to know the divine, or to recognize.
Yeah.
The divine. So you start
Think
out.
think about the poetry of Rumi.
Right.
You know, Rumi writes love songs to God and Shamsi Tabriz.
And yet it's through Tabriz that path opened up for him, right? There's a certain role that the other personified and embodied has in that process, right?
Maybe you'd have to ask him.
Yeah. Well, I'm asking you because you're the next best person to ask about that. So do you have any views on that?
Actually, Nora would be the next best person to ask about it, not me.
All right, I'll
She-
take an answer. Why not?
Okay, what's the question? Like,
Well-
what if?
The question is, in a sense, is whether the other person as an embodied sexual person is a gateway, or can be a gateway to this transcendent appreciation of the divine, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think it's also true that they're one and the same in a sense. I mean, my perspective is that we are, gosh, it's one of those things that's hard to put into words, but to synopsize, we're not separate from God, divine, the one, the universe, whatever. So anytime we are fully connecting with another person, we are sharing in just one more expression of unity. And it just happens to be a very powerful, visceral one.
But that seems like the end point almost. I mean, as a developmental process, when you enter into that, you're not yet presumably aware of that unity. You're just aware of yourself and of, in this case, the other person. And it's the, I don't
How
know,
do you know that this is actually the case?
I'm not either, but you know, again, I speak from complete ignorance in this area, so I'm waiting to be enlightened, or at least informed.
What are we doing on time? We're getting a little short on time. I have to say a few other things, and if we have time, we can get back to this. But
So bookmark that.
yeah, bookmark that, because it's important, because it sounds like I'm saying that, well, I am saying that this is important, but one of the things that it teaches us is that when it comes to human sexuality, there are a lot of right ways to do it. If you choose to be celibate, that's the right way to do it for you. If you choose to have a relationship with one other human being of the opposite sex, that's the right way to do it. If you choose to have a relationship with one person of the same sex, that's the right way to do it. If you choose to have a polyamorous relationship with 4 or 5 other people, that's the right way to do it. The social constraints on sexuality need to be pared back down to what hurts the other. So, for instance, attempting to have a sexual relationship with somebody who is, these days we say below the age of consent, but that needs to be defined. It's hard to define that. The age of consent is different in different cultures. But, and Nancy, you might be able to help me out here, maybe not. The Torah had a specific age when somebody was, they became responsible for themselves.
Yeah, I'm
And
not sure on that.
yeah. Yeah, it's slipping my mind, but there is a point in your life where you become an adult and
Mhm.
you are responsible for your own actions. And that is where you have the age of consent. So for some people in our culture, there are 40-year-olds who have not yet reached the age of consent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the rules that protect people from being victimized tend to be objective rules. Anything else is psychological and sociological trappings as far as I'm concerned. protect the children, protect anybody from being victimized, and anything else, you know, it's a matter of what you choose to do. As far as I can tell, there is no particular objective morality to most of this stuff. I used to argue with Steve all the time because he thought that if you did not want to have a relationship, there was something wrong with you.
Steve Barnes, yeah.
Yeah, and my point of view was that choosing celibacy was just as valid as any other form of sexual behavior. And I still hold that to be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, we should probably touch on the fact that this involves not treating other people like objects and not treating yourself like an
yes.
object. Yes. And no matter what kind of sexual practices you're taking up, including celibacy, if you are not treating yourself like an object and you're not treating other people like objects, you're doing great. Like, that's the point. And that may be something that takes a little discernment to figure out. For example, people may have some feelings about BDSM type relationships. Are those treating people like objects? It really depends on the intentions and behaviors of those involved. Is there consent involved? Is there self-awareness involved? Those are the things that help you determine whether there is objectification going on or not.
And presumably, not treating others as simply an object extends not to just yourself or the potential sexual partner, but also other people in society. In other words, I mean, one of the constraints presumably is, hey, thou shalt not steal another man's wife or another man's husband and so forth. Where that seems to be, the damage there seems to be not between the two parties involved, but rather on a third party, in that case, the husband or wife, whatever.
Yeah, that's only true if the woman is property. Those sorts of things, thou shalt not covet another man's wife, is like saying thou shalt not covet another man's car.
Yeah, but the point you were just making, or Noor was just making, I forget which was that one of the touchstones of a valid relationship is that
an adult relationship.
Let's put it that way, yeah.
Yeah, is that you're not causing harm to another. And presumably the other in this case is not necessarily just you or your potential partner, but also others on whom your actions might impact, right? Like,
well,
you know, the family of the other and
well, yeah. I mean, I think I understand what you intended to say when you brought up not coveting another man's wife and stuff like that. That is legalese, but in the way that you mean it, I think of like polyamorous relationships where, let's say you have a primary couple, and then that primary couple, each of those involved in that couple may have other partners, but in a adult relationship scenario, everybody would be in the loop about everyone else, or at least would understand how to respect each other's boundaries and how to engage in ways that are forthcoming and respectful, things like that.
Yeah, and everybody would have worked out their jealousies way before then.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm glad you brought that up, because there's this other thing that is part of the societal imprint. It goes back to thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife.
Yeah.
This goes back to women as property, women as objects whose sole purpose is to perpetuate the genetic line of the male.
Mm-hmm.
When you get a situation like this, which is every patriarchal society on the planet, the only way that kind of society can exist is if the woman is property.
Yeah.
Now you look at a matriarchal situation or a matrilineal situation. Take the Navajos or the Apaches. They have a matrilineal line. A woman has a baby, and her husband is not related to the baby in any significant form. The woman's family is related to the baby. The man's job is to take care of any babies that the woman has, whether they might have been, quote, his babies or somebody else's babies that she had before she met him. They're all his kids until such time as one of them divorces or dies. But it's the woman's family who the children, they say, belong to. It's a much saner way to do it.
Oh, interestingly enough, I suppose on the patriarchal side, I mean, if the main intent was to make sure that, you know, it's going to be my kid that she bears, now with genetic testing, there's other ways of doing that.
Yeah, and the interesting thing that turns out is genetic testing demonstrates that oftentimes that kid is not genetically yours.
Wow.
The percentage was fairly low.
Yeah.
Fairly low is still some.
Yeah.
Actually, I was quite interested in the genetic results of both my daughters. But they turned out to be mine.
Yeah, see, if I had had kids, or I should say, if my partner had had children with me, I don't think I would have cared. I wasn't raised that way.
Mm.
It would be like, cool, a kid. Let's raise him up right. Here, have a sword, kid.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that gets into, well, one thing that's coming to mind is society is something we kind of collectively create into an object. You know, we give it that that nounness by calling it by giving it this sense of control over us as this amorphous entity called society. We do tend to imbue it with authority that it only really has in our imaginations. And that's where things like this come into play, where we start to define our ethics and our morality in terms of our human adulthood. And I think that's where evolution comes into play as well.
Expand on that, Kurt, because I'm not sure I completely get what you're saying there.
Well, we give authority to this entity that we call society, and we by default tend to allow society, quote unquote, to dictate our norms to us. What is safe for us to do, what is right and wrong for us to do, as opposed to using discernment and this idea of celebrating subjectivity, embracing it, supporting it. We tend to give up the work of doing that by leaning so hard into what has been bequeathed to us by this entity that we call society.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Though I guess very seldom will I ever have, at least personally, the notion of society imposing something. I do often have the notion of particular people who are perhaps representative of society, but in a extended family or
Yeah.
versus
Yeah, if you want a sense of society doing that, marry 3 more wives.
yeah, yeah. the law would then be a
Yep.
manifestation of that society. Yeah.
Or even better, get your wife to marry 3 more husbands. Society would totally freak out over that one.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, okay. Chris asks, can you say more about the concept of quote fantasy unquote and the role it plays in our awakeness?
Fantasy removes us from awakeness. There is not much more to say about that.
Mm.
If you are deeply involved in a fantasy, you are not awake. You are, by definition, dreaming in a certain sense.
Yeah. So is this where dating Maya comes into play?
Yeah.
Having sexy times with Maya?
And being, I haven't been around for a couple of nights, so I got to get my contrarian persona out here.
Okay. Go for it, Omar.
What about those techniques which involve visualizations? Aren't they, in a sense, fantasy? I
What
mean, you're
about them?
visualizing a god Umfa, whatever not, and through that visualization, you so focus your attention.
So, Ilmar, let me ask you an important question before you go any further. Have you ever heard Noor or I advocate for any of those techniques?
No, I haven't.
No, so you're talking to the wrong people there, because we don't do that shit.
Well, but I mean, wouldn't you consider that to be fantasy, though?
I tend to, yeah.
Yeah. And
I mean,
yet,
I know that Tibetans can pull that off.
Yeah.
And make it work, but I'm not trained along those lines. So I can't really say anything about it. And I don't think that Noor is, at least she hasn't told me.
Yeah, I wouldn't have much to say about that either.
Come on,
Unfortunately.
you got secrets, Noor. Get them out.
I spill my secrets a little bit at a time, but
Good enough. Yeah. I mean, it's just that it seems like certain paths involve fantasies and other aspects of the unawake state as a presumably workable means to awakening. Now they.
Yeah, but more often than not, those things are just having a night on the town with Maya.
Could well be.
Yep. We did a talk about that some time ago, didn't we, Noor? On the fantasy work?
yeah, I believe so. We should.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make a note of that.
Yeah, I'll put up an end slide for it so people can go back and review something along the traps along the path, and the fantasy work is the traps along the path.
I mean, there may be something out there that is legit, just as much talk as mentioning like Tibetan stuff, but for the most part, I do think it's, as I'm sure I said in those talks a bunch, it's people chasing the shiny thing. They want the thing that feeds their ego desires, and they find a thing that suits that suits whatever their fantasy is, and they roll with it thinking that they found something really great. In the end, it's probably more often than not a dead end, just feeding ego stuff.
Yeah, and like I said, the Tibetans seem to have found a way to do that works for them, but I am not an initiate into that, and you'd have to talk with a Tibetan priest or something.
Yeah. And we leave space for that. If that is a path that interests someone, then they would have to put in the work to uncover it and find the right context and appropriate teachers for that. All of that stuff absolutely comes into play.
So, what have we not covered that we need to cover?
Well, I don't know if you need to cover it, but there was something I was wondering about when you were talking about evolution and how unusual people's sexuality is, which is there's no obvious reason for people to have evolved the sexuality to go along with our mental capacities. And yet we've got these possibilities that maybe animals don't have. And I was wondering whether you have a belief that evolution is, so to speak, pulled as well as pushed. That there's something going on that isn't just adaptation.
I don't know, but it's a really good question. I do note that of the animals in the world that exhibit the same kinds of sexuality that humans do,
Mhm.
they are the smartest animals on the planet. Dolphins, arguably smarter than people in many ways. They've been around all of this time and they've never had a war.
They're kind of assholes sometimes, though. But
They
so
are
are
kind
we.
of assholes sometimes.
Well, they don't have the temptations we do.
And they also don't have the opposable thumbs, which I think is one of the things that got us into trouble. But
That's
also,
one of the temptations.
yeah,
Mm,
also bonobos, of the primates, bonobos are really smart and totally different than chimpanzees in
Mhm.
many, many ways, even though most people couldn't tell them apart.
Any other thoughts or questions?
I'm curious about techniques associated with these practices, or just like source material that discusses these that you hold in high regard.
The only source material I could recommend is a book called Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson that would explain to you something about imprint vulnerability. Bob was a great human being, one of my favorites.
Robert Anton Wilson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant writer. Great guy. Smoked too much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yep. It's a little bit dated, but there's so much there. It's definitely worth the read. Yeah.
Well, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I'm good too. But if anyone has any questions, you can share them now, or you can ask on the forum or in the chat. I mean, the comments on the video. Go for it. I'm definitely curious to see what comes up for people after having a little bit of time to contemplate. But other than that, I'm good tonight. All right, shall we do our Brady Bunch mode and wave goodbye to everybody?
All right, let me switch the view over to gallery view.
All right, thanks for joining us, everybody, and we will be here next week, as always.
Take care, folks.
Good night.